Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth and final lesson in our series of lessons about political parties and interest groups. Today is our fourth lesson, and so today's lesson is going to be about interest groups. We've already covered political parties in a great deal of detail, so it's time to round it out and talk about interest groups and how they are different from political parties. That will be the subject of today's lesson. So the first question we're going to ask, a left side question if you're taking your notes Cornell style, is what are interest groups? And I'm going to try to put this in the simplest terms I can, but it's pretty much exactly what the title says. Like the title suggests, interest groups are organizations that advocate for a specific cause or interest. So a political party needs to have positions on all kinds of things: foreign policy, domestic policy, economics, taxation. An interest group can simply be focused on one issue and will basically support any political party or candidate that supports their issue in the way they want. And there are many different kinds of interest groups. Some interest groups will support economic interests. So, for example, advocating for a universal $15 minimum wage would be advocating for economic interests, or advocating for health care for everybody, because health care costs a lot of money and some people can't afford it. So that's basically advocating for economic interests. There are those who advocate for equal opportunity interests. So any group in society that has historically been discriminated against or has greater difficulty getting opportunities, whether that be the opportunity to attend college, the opportunity to get a job, the opportunity to be paid the same as other people, any organization that advocates for equal opportunity could be considered an equal opportunity interest group. There are public interest groups that tend to be very single issue oriented. So the NRA, the National Rifle Association, advocates for gun rights, period. That is the only thing the NRA cares about. The Sierra Club advocates for preservation of the natural world and does not really delve into other areas of public policy. They're single issue groups. Groups that both support and oppose abortion, same thing. Their issue is abortion, period. And there are government interest groups, and I'm not going to really talk about that very much, but foreign governments do try to influence each other, and foreign governments do pay people to advocate on their behalf. For instance, foreign governments pay people to lobby or advocate in front of our Congress and our president. We're not going to talk about that particular kind of interest group today. So interest groups can advocate for many things. They can advocate for social change, something they want to see change in society. So interest groups that came out of the George Floyd protests, like Black Lives Matter, although Black Lives Matter did exist before the George Floyd protests, definitely are advocating for social change in terms of how policing is done in this country. They can advocate for specific laws or policies. What specific law do they want passed or changed? So, for instance, cannabis legalization has been successful in many states. There are advocacy groups that support that and helped put those things on the ballot in states like Oregon that ended up legalizing recreational cannabis use. Endorsing candidates for office. Basically, if a candidate is willing to sing the song of the interest group, that interest group tends to give money to those candidates and endorse them. So if a candidate is very, very pro-choice in terms of abortion, they're very likely to get support from Planned Parenthood, for example. And just simply shining a light on issues. Part of the purpose of an interest group is to simply make people aware of what their issue is by raising money, advertising, and mobilizing people to talk about that issue. So this is not at all a complete summary of what interest groups do, but in terms of this being 8th grade social studies, it gives you a good sense of what interest groups are and the role they play. So let's continue. What do interest groups actually do? Let's talk about that. Interest groups work outside of government to change or influence what takes place inside of government. So political parties are all about gaining power and exercising that power from within government. Interest groups basically try to influence government and influence society as a whole to care about their issue and do something about it. And that's by raising awareness, raising money, and sometimes outwardly supporting specific candidates. There are left-wing interest groups, otherwise known as democratic interest groups, to the extent that the Democratic Party is on the left wing of American politics, or right-wing interest groups, which we would generally say are Republican interest groups that associate themselves with the Republican Party. Or there can be interest groups that simply focus on the issue, and if Democrats are willing to support their issue, they're perfectly happy with that, and if Republicans are willing to support their issue, they're perfectly happy with that. They're more looking to get their issue dealt with, and they're less concerned about whether it's Democrats or Republicans that support them. They just want attention paid to their issue. So they'll take support wherever they can find it. Interest groups generally try to raise money, mobilize support, raise awareness, and influence decision makers. So the first thing you have to do is have money to promote your issue. Second thing you need to do is find as many people as you can possibly find who believe in your issue and want to support you. With that money and with those people, you want to raise awareness to the best of your ability. That means advertising, that means public demonstrations, that means basically doing the things you can do to amplify your message so that people hear it and receive it. And then the final thing you want to do is influence the people who actually make decisions, usually within government. If you have the ability to do that, you are essentially punching above your weight because you are engaging in what is called collective action. People are much more effective when they engage in collective action than they are when they go off and act like lone rangers. Many political leaders often start off working for interest groups, and sometimes political leaders will actually leave office and go back to working for interest groups once they leave office. So it's kind of a revolving door in some ways. So I'm going to talk to you about left-leaning interest groups, and I'm going to talk to you about right-leaning interest groups and give you a sense, and maybe this will help you to understand kind of what's on the left side of the political spectrum versus what's on the right side of the political spectrum. Left-leaning interest groups. So in America, those would be interest groups that generally support the Democratic Party or are associated more with the Democratic Party than with the Republican Party. Although not entirely, these groups will interact with and try and influence Republicans as well, but they will have a much more friendly audience among Democrats. Let's just put it that way. So the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has been promoting civil rights and equal treatment for African Americans for a very long time. And at a previous point in history, African Americans were often referred to as colored people. Since the 1990s, the term African American has been considered the most socially acceptable and appropriate. MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, defends the legal rights of migrants from Mexico and U.S. citizens who are of Mexican descent against discrimination of any kind, legal or otherwise. The American Civil Liberties Union basically exists to promote all forms of civil liberty. And anytime the ACLU perceives government as infringing on people's rights or taking away from people's rights, the ACLU will step in and often offer free legal support. So it promotes freedom of personal choice and expression regardless of political affiliation or lifestyle. The ACLU will defend anyone whose rights are being violated for the most part, although it tends to be considered a left-leaning organization. The Natural Resources Defense Council, it should say advocates rather than advocated, it's not past tense, for the preservation of natural spaces, biodiversity, and combating climate change. So it's an environmental organization that wants to protect what open natural spaces remain, the biodiversity within those natural spaces, and it considers climate change to be real, urgent, and wants to encourage government action to do something about it. The Human Rights Campaign is a civil rights organization that advocates for the freedom of opportunity and expression for the LGBTQ community, basically believing that no one in the LGBT community should be discriminated against for any reason. The Coalition to Stop Gun Violence advocates, I don't know why these advocated is there again, but it is, I'll fix it, for gun control and restrictions on what kinds of guns can be purchased. So they recognize that the Second Amendment exists, but they would argue that just because the Second Amendment exists doesn't mean that we can't have licensing for guns so that we know who's buying a gun, and that we can restrict what kinds of guns people can have. Like, do ordinary American citizens need to have the right to own military-style assault weapons, or should there be limitations on what kinds of guns people can own? I'm not taking a side there, but that would definitely be something that the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence would definitely have an opinion on. And then there's Planned Parenthood, which advocates for reproductive rights and the freedom of a woman to legally choose abortion. Planned Parenthood is not just a pro-choice organization, but it advocates for all kinds of reproductive rights for men and women alike. So those are some left-leaning interest groups. There's a lot more than this. I'm just giving you examples. This is not in any way, shape, or form intended to be an all-inclusive list. So let's look at some right-leaning interest groups, or interest groups that would get a much friendlier reception in the Republican Party than they would in the Democratic Party, which doesn't mean that there aren't some Democrats who would at least listen to what they have to say. NARAL, the National Right to Life Action League. It specifically opposes legal abortion and supports any candidates who oppose abortion. Pretty straightforward. The National Rifle Association defends the rights of gun owners and supports gun ownership with no restrictions. The NRA basically says the Second Amendment applies to everybody. There can be no restrictions. We will stand up against any kind of restriction on gun ownership whatsoever. The FRC, the Family Research Council, advocates for the presence of faith-based, mostly Christian, public policies based on the family. It's also an anti-abortion organization, but it also advocates for Christian-based policies in government. The Federalist Society is a group that advocates for the appointment of conservative federal judges who have a limited view of civil rights and the power of the federal government. Many Republican presidents choose members of the Federalist Society to be judges and justices on the Supreme Court. CPAC is a very powerful organization. It's the Conservative Political Action Committee. It supports basically very hard right-wing candidates for state and federal offices. It has an annual convention that has become quite the dog and pony show, and it's a annual to-do in Republican circles. And then the American Petroleum Institute is an organization that advocates for the interests of the fossil fuel industry and to limit government action on climate change. There are some Democratic members of Congress who will listen to the API, but it mostly is considered a right-wing friendly interest group. Although, just like I said with the Democratic interest groups, this is not intended to be an all-inclusive list, and this doesn't mean that this list of organizations only supports Republicans. They will talk to Democrats as well, but generally these are considered right-leaning interest groups. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is your introduction to interest groups, so you know what time it is. It is time, once again, to write a summary. Your summary should include a definition of what interest groups are. It should include a summary of what interest groups do. I gave you some nice bullet points on that one. It should talk about the different types of interest groups there are, and I should probably put the letter S in there. It's not good when I proofread when I'm actually recording the video, but, you caught me. That's what I'm doing. And give me some examples of some right and left-leaning interest groups. If you do that, you will have an amazing summary. And if you do that, Mr. Blumendahl will be happy. And you know what time it is now. It is time, once again, for Mr. Blumendahl to sign off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube network.